It's not a very big community at all. And they said to me, when you go back home, do everything you can to create good relations between Baptists and Muslims in the United States, because it will only help us here in the Middle East. So I heard that. That was, I think, November we were there, October of November. The following April, I was in the Republic of Georgia. I'd been invited there during Holy Week to speak and to preach in the Baptist churches there. And so as we were in that country, I met the head of the Muslims in the Republic of Georgia, and sitting in his office, and we're ending our time, and I stand up to go, and he looks me right in the eye as he takes my hand, and he says, "I charge you to work for good relations between Christians and Muslims in your country as we have here in the Republic of Georgia." Well, I heard that twice in different settings. So I came back to our board, and I said, I really think this is the Spirit of God speaking to us as American Baptists out of our long tradition and commitment to being peacemakers. It was probably about 2 years earlier. I had been in Japan. I had been at the Peace Shrine in Hiroshima. And our missionary who was with me said, "Roy, I want to take you upstairs." And she said, you can't read Japanese, but I will read it for you. And it was in 1947, in the gathering of American Baptists in their annual meeting, that they had declared there shall be no more Hiroshimas. And she showed that to me there. And so our commitment to peacemaking as American Baptists is a long tradition. And certainly in this world today, interfaith conflict is a major contributor to the disruption of peace in the world. And so I came to our board and I said, I think this is something God is calling us to be engaged in. And so out of that, we began to explore what can we do? How can we as American Baptists enter into this conflict in a way that helps to bring peace with justice and helps us live with our neighbor for the common good of all. And so out of that, we began to explore and to do various things. Now, one of the things that was happening that opened a door for us was it was about this very time that leaders and scholars in the Muslim community had created a document called the Common Word. If you've not heard about this, go home and Google it when you get home. This Common Word was an invitation to the Christian community by the Muslim community to dialogue. And it said this at the conclusion: until Christians, Jews, and Muslims live in peace together, the world will not live in peace. And they set out 2 words that they said we hold together as in Scripture as Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Each of our scriptures affirm 2 words, 2 what we would call commandments. The first and greatest of these, said Jesus, is, you shall love the Lord your God. And the second is likened to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. They were gracious enough to quote the words of our Lord Jesus in naming those 2 words. Again, opening a door for us as the Christian community to enter into dialogue, to begin to challenge the radicalism that was creating so much conflict. And so taking that document, we as American Baptists have put together 2 national dialogues of Christians and Muslims, primarily scholars, because we wanted to create both a scriptural and a theological base for people who would say, why are you dialoguing with Muslims? what does this have to do with the gospel? And so we gathered the first in Andover, Dayton, at the seminary there with Dr. Carter's help. He was president of the seminary. And we focused on the second word, love of God. Love of neighbor. We focused on that second word, and we asked Muslim and Baptist presenters to talk about a number of things. One, what do our respective scriptures say about love of neighbor? What is in our holy books that teach us what love of neighbor is? Secondly, how has that been expressed in our communities? How have we learned to live that out in our life as the church or in the life of the Islamic community? And then thirdly, where are some signs of hope today that you see in your community in relationship to one or the other, either the Christian or the Jewish community or the Muslim community, depending on where you are in this? And so we had our first dialogue. Then we had our second dialogue, love of God as the pathway to peace. And so again, we ask our scholars to reflect on what does Scripture say about love of God as the pathway to peace. Secondly, how do we live that out in our communities? And third, again, where are signs of hope that you see? So we held these two national dialogues. We put the papers together, and those papers are available for our churches, for Sunday schools, lesson plans to study, to review. At the same time, the Baptist World Alliance was putting together a response to the invitation called A Common Word. And my Muslim friends here in the United States, the heads of the Islamic Society of North America and others, say it is one of the best responses that they received. It was, if you Google A Common Word, you will see first the document that was sent to the Christian community, and then you'll see all the responses of all the different world communions of the Christian faith. And so I'd encourage you to go and find those, read those, and look at the one from the Baptist World Alliance. I think the Baptist World Alliance response did two things. One, it said, this is a gift of grace to us. And we do, in these two words, have common ground in which we can begin to talk about the greater good of the world, the life of the world. How do we contribute to that together? And secondly, and I think one of the things they appreciated, is that not to be contentious, but we want to explore with you your understanding of God and our understanding of God as Trinity, and how the inner relationship of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is a relationship of love that overflows into the life of the world in love. So we want to understand how you conceive of God and how God's love comes forth into the world as we further dialogue about the Trinitarian nature of God. And I think the Muslim community really appreciated that integrity on our behalf as Christians. I've often said in these dialogues, our goal is not to create Buslims. We're not there to make Baptists and Muslims some mishmash. Each of us comes in the integrity of our faith to the dialogue. If I don't come in my integrity as a Christian to the dialogue, it's not a dialogue. If my Muslim neighbor doesn't come in the integrity of their faith, it's not a dialogue. And so in these dialogues, we have emphasized that each of us comes with the integrity of our faith for us to learn from one another. So we've held those two national dialogues. And then I extended an invitation to our seminaries. I said, we want this to become more local. And so I invite you as American Baptist related seminaries to consider holding such a dialogue in your area. So Virginia Union and Richmond held such a dialogue. American Baptist Seminary of the West in Berkeley held such a dialogue. And Central Baptist Seminary in Kansas City held a dialogue. Now, what we did not know, especially as we were planning the dialogue for Kansas City, was that the date we had chosen for the dialogue would be the Saturday after the bombing of the Boston Marathon. So tensions were high. Some people were saying, we need to cancel this because tensions are so high. But wiser heads prevailed, and other people said, no, that's exactly why we need this dialogue now. And so Baptist Christians from the Kansas City area and Muslims from the Kansas City area came together. Now, in that dialogue, the talk wasn't about abstract theological principles. It was about how do we live together. Your children and my children go to the same neighborhood school. What are you saying to your children about Muslims? What are you saying to your children about Christians? What can we do in Kansas City to make this a place where we all feel safe, where we all feel comfortable? And out of that experience, the Muslims of Kansas City at their next annual meeting invited American Baptists to come and presented an award to them for hosting that dialogue and for beginning to reach out to their Muslim neighbors in their community. I thought that was a wonderful testimony about the power of these conversations, the power of just meeting with people who are your neighbors. We have Muslim doctors who treat our bodies. Our children have Muslim teachers who teach them reading, writing, arithmetic. We have Muslim scholars in our universities. They are our neighbors. And so reaching out and finding ways that we can work together for common good is really critical, I think, for us in our witness as disciples of Jesus. We know about all of the terrorist acts that take place. Pat and I were serving in New Jersey when 9/11 occurred and the towers fell. Pat had members of her congregation who were in the Twin Towers. She had the father of one of her members who was on the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. I had calls from my pastor. I was executive of New Jersey. I had calls from my pastors at that time saying, I've been to the morgue, 4 or 5 times already to identify bodies. I can't go again. I need help. And I was trying to pair pastors who weren't directly affected with them to try to comfort them, trying to ease their burden, even as they worked for over a year in our county. Every single day in the obituaries, there were the names of newly identified bodies of those who had been killed in the tower. So, that was a horrible, tragic event, deeply felt by us in New Jersey as well as in the rest of our country. But it was in the midst of that, I sent a letter to our American Baptist churches in New Jersey, and I said 2 things. One, let us remember our commitment to religious liberty, how precious that was and has been to us as Baptists, as a minority group. And let us extend that to our Muslim neighbors. And secondly, let's not tar every one of our Muslim neighbors with the brush of terrorism, because there are good people living in our midst who are Muslims. And this is our call now, that if you learn of a mosque that is being threatened in your community, you need to gather around that mosque to help protect it. We need to work for peace in this very difficult situation. And it was out of that then that the Islamic Society of North America contacted me and said, thank you for this. You don't know what it means in such a difficult time for us to receive such affirmation. So then, several years later, we as American Baptists joined with the Islamic Society of North America, Jewish and other Christian groups to create Shoulder to Shoulder, a group that is working in the U.S. against Islamophobia. One of the things we're probably less aware of are some of the things that are happening in the Muslim world to build bridges with us. I've mentioned the Common Word. By February a year ago, I was invited to Morocco for a gathering of Islamic scholars from around the world and 50 Christians who were invited from around the world to meet with them as they were putting together a document that came to be known as the Marrakesh Declaration. And what these scholars had been working on, much at the behest of the Islamic Society of North America, is a document that spells out the rights of religious liberty of minority faiths in predominantly Muslim countries. I mean, they were wanting to root out of, the Islamic Society in North America keeps saying, we are so grateful to Baptists. You gave us religious liberty. Now we want to help give it to the rest of the world too. And so they have been urging scholars to work on this concept of religious liberty and rooting it in the Quran and in the teachings of Muhammad and his activities. And so they gathered this group in Marrakesh to finalize that document, in which that document declares, based on the Quran and on the teachings and actions of Muhammad, one, that there is to be no compulsion in religion. There is to be no compulsion in religion. And secondly, that every citizen, whether they're Christian or whether they're Muslim or Jewish, in predominantly Muslim countries, have certain basic equal rights. And among those is the right to worship as one chooses. Well, this document is a tremendous breakthrough as it talks about, in their language, the rights of citizenship in a predominantly Muslim setting. And it was written as a counter to the extremism that we see happening in the world. Well, now others have built on that. There was a gathering in Iraq of Christian and Muslim scholars where they took that document and they said, well, how do we live this out in Iraq? What does it mean in terms of equal citizenship? The same thing has now just happened in Egypt, where the Grand Imam, the chief spiritual leader of the Sunni Muslims in the world, called together a conference around the rights of citizens in Egypt. And Jim Winkler, the President General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, was invited to be a part of that. And again, a very strong statement, and it came right on the heels of some of the atrocities against Coptic Christians in the U.S. A very strong affirmation by these Islamic leaders in Egypt of the rights of Christians and others to worship freely without recrimination, without a lessening of their standing as citizens in Egypt. And those efforts are, I think, ought to encourage every one of us. This isn't just a one-sided thing of, as some people might think, just the Christians reaching out. It is Muslims reaching out. Pat and I had the privilege, after Marrakesh, I was invited to Egypt in April as a part of a dialogue between the U.S. and Egyptian scholars, religious leaders, and government officials. We had held the first one 2 years before in D.C. This one was in Cairo. So I was there, and we were talking again about this intersection of our faith for common good. Then in July, we were invited to go back for us to work. The Protestant churches in Egypt have put together a dialogue of their own for Christians and Muslims. But they call together leaders of community organizations across Egypt, half with Muslim leaders, half with Christian leaders. And so they asked us to come and talk about dialogues we were having in the U.S., how we were trying to bridge some of the principles of that. But they also said to this group, we're putting you in clusters according to your geography, your proximity to one another, and you have to come up with a project for your community, for your area, that will build trust, that will build understanding between the Christian and Muslim community in your town, in your geography. And so those efforts are underway in many places in the Middle East of sowing the leaven in the midst in the lump of the flour of the dough. And I think that is something that I would invite your prayers for, that those efforts would continue and would grow. At the same time, here in the United States, I think it is really important, especially after the rhetoric of our last presidential campaign, that we say very clearly that we desire to reach out in love and affirmation of Muslims within this country. I recently spoke in Rochester at a gathering of Christians and Muslims, and I said to them, none of us would purposely or knowingly invite someone into our home that was going to do harm to our family. We don't want to do the same thing nationally, but the way to do that is not by saying every Muslim is a terrorist and we will keep them all out. We have other ways of vetting people to determine who can be a threat and who is not. I think it's really important now that local congregations like yours continue your voice. We were in was it Kansas City, Pat, where we saw the signs in the yards just last week?
Many places that we've been, and that's been heartening.
Yeah, it just says, we welcome our neighbors, and it was in English, Spanish, and Arabic. We welcome our neighbors. I think it's really important that local congregations let your voice be heard, and that you work with your Muslim neighbors around some of these difficult issues of how we are a witness to the rest of the world about the blessings of religious liberty and how people of different faiths can live together in one country and work for the welfare of one another. And I think that's one of the great gifts we can give out of our Baptist heritage around religious liberty. We must not forget that in our beginnings we were persecuted. We were persecuted not by Muslims, and not by Hindus, not by Buddhists. We were persecuted by other Christians who didn't like what we believed. And Thomas Helwys wrote the first declaration on religious liberty in the English language and was promptly thrown into prison for daring to write King James. And this is irony for me. Baptists love King James Bible. And King James threw us all in prison as he could, you know. That's an irony of life. But we have this tremendous witness from the very beginnings. Here in the U.S., religious liberty was not guaranteed in the Constitution. And Baptists had to struggle to see that separation of church and state and religious liberty were placed in the Bill of Rights. So we have a long history as Baptists of working for the rights of all to worship and to live together in peace with one another. And I think it's important we continue that tradition today. So let me stop.
About the patriotism of the North American.
Oh, right. For several, each year I've been invited to attend the annual gathering of the Islamic Society of North America. And there are a couple of things I've noted. One is their workshops. One of their key workshops last year was preventing radicalization of our youth. They're concerned about that. They don't want to lose their children to this crazy ideology of ISIS. They're concerned about that. So they're offering workshops to parents about how to prevent the radicalization of your child. But secondly, and we would not do this at a Baptist gathering because it verges too much on church and state issues for us, but at every one of their meetings there is the trooping of the American flag up to the front of the auditorium and the Pledge of Allegiance and singing God Bless America. Now, we don't do that at our American Baptist Biennials, partly because of our sensitivity to church-state issues, but they do that as an affirmation that they are citizens of this country and they have loyalty to this country and to the building of a good nation for all. So I think those are some of the things I'd encourage you to keep in mind as this great effort in the Muslim world in terms of movement towards the endorsement of religious liberty as a way of life for all, and the efforts in the Muslim community to bridge with us as Christians. So let me stop and see what questions you may have. We've got about, 10, 15 minutes? Yes. Yes. Yes, and Orthodox as well. There are different communities are working with the Muslim community around this. When I was at the gathering in Marrakesh, where the document was put together, there was a global representation of the church, including not only Protestants but Roman Catholics and Orthodox as well. So there is a lot of work among our three communions. And through the National Council of Churches, we have been holding Christian-Muslim dialogues as well as Christian-Jewish dialogues now for probably about 15 years. And we just announced that now we are starting Christian-Hindu dialogue and Christian-Buddhist dialogue as well because of some of the global conflicts with those communities, with our faith community as well. But Catholics are also reaching out, and the Pope Francis has spoken very strongly. He was in Cairo together with Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch, or the Orthodox churches, as well as Jim Winkler of the National Council of Churches in the U.S. And I can't ever say his name correctly, but also the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, all together to try to address this issue. Yes? The question about is there effort within Islam to work to keep Sunnis and Shia from killing each other? Yes, there is. That's one of the things the Islamic Society of North America has been working on as well. In their membership, it doesn't matter whether you're Sunni or Shia. And even in the Republic of Georgia, when I was meeting with the Grand Mufti there, he said, in our mosque, Sunni and Shia worship together. They pray together. And so there are efforts within that community to bind up the wounds among them as well. So that's really important. a friend of mine who is a Shia Muslim. We were talking about the situation in the Middle East and about the decreasing number of Christians who are fleeing and relocating around the world. And he said, Dr. Medley, you need to know this. He said, when ISIS enters into a village, they ask first, who are the Shia? And then they ask, who are the Christians? He said, the Shia are the first to be singled out, to be persecuted, then the Christians. And so there is within the Muslim community this sense of we have to end this internal fratricide, much like we would have had in Europe during some of the horrible wars there based in Protestant Catholic. And so they're working on that. So that's another thing to pray for as well. What else? Yes.
My grandson next week is going backpacking in the Republic of Georgia.
Oh, wonderful.
And thank you for your work.
He'll have a great time. Our American Baptist women said to me, we've been in this emphasis for a while, and they said, come and meet with our executive committee because we want to figure out what we can do in this. And so American Baptist Women's Ministries have taken on two projects. One is in the Republic of Georgia, where they are taking Baptist and Muslim women from the United States to meet with Baptist and Muslim women in the Republic of Georgia, building relationships transnationally as well as across faith lines. And so that's been, they're very excited about that. They have their third visit coming up this year. So if any of you as women are interested in the possibility of participating in that, then contact Virginia Holmstrom with American Baptist Women's Ministries. The other thing they have done is after 9/11 in D.C., there was a gathering of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish women that was sparked by a Muslim woman who said, we have to do something together. And so I put Virginia Holmstrom, the head of American Baptist Women's Ministries, in touch with her. And I said, I think if our ABW circles in our churches take this on in terms of their locality, learn from how they've done it in D.C. I said, that's going to be transformative. So if you want to transform the church, you start with the women. They've been in the forefront of change in the life of the church. So if our ABW circles begin to say, how do we do this? And you provide assistance to them in terms of some guides and all. I said, that will be wonderful. And so they are now undertaking that as well. They just did a podcast on that effort. So if you have ABW circles here, that can be a project that you can take on as well. So yes and yes.
Just knowing how diverse we are as American Baptists alone, and Baptists beyond our denomination, has there been any pushback or any strong opposition to having this kind of dialogue?
I was surprised. I got a lot of letters about a lot of different things when I was general secretary. But when we announced this, I did not get a single negative letter, not a single one. Nobody tweeted me. I couldn't believe it. There was a lot of affirmation of, yes, this is what we need to do. So that made me really proud of us. Yes. Some are. I was invited to go to Iran 3 years ago, again as a part of an effort to build bridges between religious leaders in Iran and religious leaders here. And some of the leaders who were on that were from the National Association of Evangelicals. And they were very, very keen to be involved in trying to build better relationships, not just between Iran and the U.S., but between Muslims and Christians as well. So I would say even in traditionally more conservative circles, there is a recognition, like the Common Word said, until we live in peace, the world will not live in peace. And they want to do something about that. So, yes.
This is kind of a shift in topic, but it just was so heartening to hear that you were part of Pope Francis's synod on the family.
Yes.
Because Pope Francis has done amazing things.
Yes, he.
Uniting Christians of all denominations, but I had no idea that Protestants were at that meeting and had a bit of a voice.
It was.
Say a little about that.
Okay, she asked about the synod on the family that Francis called. It was the second synod, and generally at these synods they invite representatives from the communions, world communions, with whom they are in dialogue. And we had just finished our second dialogue between Baptist World Alliance and the Roman Catholic Church. So the Baptist World Alliance asked if I would represent Baptist in that gathering. So there were the Anglican Communion, Methodist, different stripes of Orthodox were there. Lutheran, the Lutheran World Federation was represented. And each bishop was given an opportunity 3 minutes to address the whole conclave, and each of us as fraternal delegates, we were called, were also given 3 minutes. And we were invited to be a part of the workshops as well. They had a document they were working on, and it was the group I was in. They were very solicitous about my input. I was surprised. I thought, well, I'll just be there to listen and I won't be invited to participate. But no, they asked me to say some words about the document. And at one point, we were on one section, and I said, I just find this very offensive as a Protestant, this section. Well, what do we do with it? How do we fix it? I said, I don't know of any good way you can fix it. You ought to just take it out. And they said, well, we'll note that. We were one of several groups meeting. Another section, it was on the purpose of family. And I said to them, you are so focused on procreation as the sole purpose of marriage that you forget that in the account in Genesis, the reason Eve is created is because Adam is lonely. So you have nothing in this document about companionship and friendship. Marriage as companionship, nothing in there. It's all on procreation. I said, what do you do with families that can't procreate? Are they defective marriages? So we had a bit of give and take on some things. But I was very honored to be able to be there. Francis was pushing a lot of people thought the major issue is going to be around the inclusion of the LGBTQ community. It wasn't that. The major issue was the inclusion of divorced and remarried people. Yes, that was it. And and Francis was pressing for the inclusion, for them to be able to come to communion. But he ran into a brick wall, and I discovered a pope has as much authority as a Baptist General Secretary does when it really comes down to it. He ran into a brick wall. And that's why, in my words, I spoke about the quality of mercy and about people seeking mercy, and how in our Baptist experience we express that as Jesus as friend. What a friend we have in the lowly Jesus. And so that was the big issue. And they did not budge on that. Francis, in one of the worship services, spoke about, again, in his effort to push people to a different place, spoke of a young boy who came for First Communion. And his mother was divorced and remarried another man, and she could not come to church and take communion. Neither could her husband. And so when he was handed the wafer, he hid it in his sleeve. And Francis said, and when he went home, he took it, and he broke it, and he gave it to his parents. Well, that was Francis trying to prepare for a kinder, gentler church. But he ran into a brick wall at that point. So that was the major issue there at the Conference on the Family, yeah. But it was an honor to be there, and I was, I dressed like a Baptist. The Swiss Guard would bow to everybody that was wearing a collar. I'd walk by, and so I started bowing to them. So honoring all of God's children, So anyway, I had fun.
I appreciate the globalization, the efforts. I'm trying to work within my own community, and it's very difficult. Our very small school has a huge population now in Turkey, and I hear from both sides, and there's fear on both sides.
Yes.
Especially because this involves people's children.
Right.
Turkish children and the local children who know all of it. And it's very, very difficult to get, there's a strong language barrier,
Yes.
even when they bring the Turkish community, when they send someone home, there's still a very strong language barrier.
She's speaking about the challenge of the local situation in terms of the influx of immigrants, particularly in this situation of immigrants from Turkey, the fear that there is present around that, both within them and within the community that's receiving them. It is hard work. And I think, you've got several factors here. We've been bringing in Burmese refugees, Christians who are Baptists, been persecuted by the central government, by the military government in Burma. We've been resettling them like crazy in the United States. That's hard because of the different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds, and they're Christians. I mean, they share our faith. They're more American Baptists than most of us are because of our history of mission there. And so when you add those layers of difficulty, different culture, different understanding of way of life, different languages, and you add to that a faith that is seen to have a terrorist element in it that creates a lot of fear, it makes it hard work. And that's why I think beginning in these small ways is important. Well, I think one-to-one is really important. Being a friend to someone. I think, even that simple act of having on your lawn in Arabic or Turkish in this instance, the sign says, we welcome all our neighbors. I think those are signs that people look for. And they may seem minuscule, but I tell you, these global things I've talked about are important, but they pale in significance to someone just reaching out to someone saying, welcome. You're my neighbor, I'm your neighbor. And trying to do things. Our third dialogue that we are in stages of planning now nationally for April of 2018 at Green Lake, we are targeting clergy 40 and younger, and in the Baptist tradition, and Muslim religious leaders 40 and younger, to come together at Green Lake. We want them to come from at least two from the same community, so that we in Green Lake, we can talk about some of these principles of dialogue and some of the examples that we have seen of churches and mosques working together to bridge some of these differences, and then send them back into their communities to do this work. So if you have a clergy person that's 40 and younger that would like to be a part of this, and there's a mosque here you can connect with, let us know. They're going to be recruiting at Green Lake, asking people to sign up for this at Green Lake, at the Biennial in Portland, and the last of June, 1st of July. We're asking for people to be nominated, and then doing the women of the church taking on this ABW project. I think those are some important ways. And I think the hardest thing is when there is a blow up, to not shrink back. I think that's important. Those Baptists in Kansas City who said, we're going to do this dialogue in spite of the bombing of the Boston Marathon, that was a gift of God to that community. So don't shrink back in the really hard times. That's the time we need to be courageous and bold. It's 12:35. What? Yes. We will be nominating Baptists, and the Islamic Society will be nominating Muslims so we're wanting to pair so that, for example, just to use here, that in Dayton we would have a Baptist religious leader and a Muslim religious leader who said, we'll come together in this to talk about how our church and our mosque can work together in our community. And part of it is, and we learned this from Egypt, that not only do they get together to talk, but they have a common project for the good of their community, whether that's something they do for a school or something they do for the environment, or whether they do a Habitat for Humanity build together or a restore project together. They do something together for the good of the community. We learned that from Egypt when we were there. I'm sorry?
Where are the registrations?
They will be online if you go to the ABC website, and they'll also be at the Biennial if you're going to be there. But we're targeting 40 and younger because we want to have a long-lasting impact. We want to start with younger leaders and have them have this experience and build on it. I look back at my own history. I was a student at Princeton, and our president, Jazz I. McCord, Dr. James I. McCord, was deeply involved in the Ecumenical Institute at Boston, and he encouraged Princeton seminary students to go there. So I went. The year I went, the theme was dialogue with people of other living faith. Now this was 1972. Little did I realize that going to that school with that theme would become such an important part of my ministry as General Secretary of American Baptist Churches. So we want to seed some of our younger leaders in this. It's not that we as older leaders don't have a role, but we want to seed this in some of our younger leaders. So, okay? And then we're going to close out. One last? Yes. Yes, yes.
And most of them are married here. So I started having relationship with this guy in the house. Now it is developing to the community. Every community now, from their country, they go even somewhere in Columbus. I don't know where they go. They heard about it. And now, in terms of what you're saying, that what can be done to bring more of them to understand that relationship with Christians will create a good community, will bring what that makes sense to everybody. What more can be done to people like that?
He was speaking about his experience in Uganda, where in outreach with his Muslim neighbors, he was teaching their children and beginning that relationship. He came here to the United States saying, I didn't know I was going to live with Muslims again. And he has a roommate who's a Muslim, right? And was talking about the dialogue and some of the difficulties of it, where he'd be confronted with, how many gods do you have as a Christian? Right. It's our teaching of the Trinity that they see as three gods, not one God present in three. But those are some of and that's why I think the women in their dialogue don't start with the theological piece. They start with, what are some of the things you're encountering day to day? And just sharing with one another on that very basic human life. When I was in this dialogue with Iran, it was Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars and religious leaders. I'm not a scholar. But we were asked to do papers on what is common ground for us. And every one of us emphasized the point of our common humanity, that we all believe we are made in the image of God, and that our common humanity is a grounding for us in this. And so I think that's important for us to remember. You're reaching out to teach the children. That's reaching to that common humanity for all of us. I've spoken about Egypt and the example of the Protestant church there, very small, tiny group, but they've taken on bridging, this commitment to bridging. Let me just share one other example, and then I'll sit down and you can do the blessing for us. Going back to Lebanon, the Baptist community there is, it's a handful of churches. It's not very big. And yet, with all of the trouble in Syria, that country has been swamped with refugees fleeing from the violence. That handful of Baptists has been in the forefront of welcoming those refugees, of providing shelter and food, clothing, of trying to provide some minimal education for their children as they are there. And that witness is not one of fear. It's not one. Now, you'd think if anybody has a right to be afraid, it'd be the Christian community in Lebanon, especially tiny Baptist community. And yet they have moved beyond their fear to reach out in love this way. Their testimony now is that on Sunday morning, many of their churches have more Muslims worshiping with them than they do of the tiny Baptist community, because people are impacted by the power of love. And that's what we have to share as the Christian community. Louise. Oh, okay, so you know the Chetties and their work there. So, but that community, their national leadership is incredible. We met a woman who's been in the forefront of this ministry. During the during the civil war in Lebanon, the Muslim militia, Christian militia, killing anybody. And in Beirut, you've heard about the Green Line. It divided Christian from Muslims. I always thought of that as something like Central Park, huge, and here's green. Well, I got there, and it's just a big boulevard. That's all it is. She and her father, because they lived in the Christian community, they had their business was in the office, was in the Muslim community. They had to cross the Green Line every day twice. They had a pact with one another. They would hold hands as they would run across the Green Line, and the pact was that if one fell, the other would let go of their hand and keep running, that both might not die. She was sick one day, could not go to work. Her father went to work as usual. He did not return. She said, I had a choice. I could hate every Muslim for what happened to my father. He was held for ransom. That's the way the militia raised money. They would hold him for ransom, and she said their demands were outrageous. No way our family could meet it. We never saw my father again. She said, I had a choice. I could hate Muslims forever for what they did to my father, or I could choose to live in the power of Jesus' love for them. And she said, I chose to live in Jesus' love. And so she's been the one who has spearheaded this welcoming of Muslim refugees from Syria. That's the power of the Spirit at work in rippling circles of grace, entering into the life of the world. Pastors?
We want to thank again. Just really honored to hear of your work and to have you with us today. You as well, Pat. It's been really wonderful. And I want to thank Pastor Louise for making this possible and helping make all the arrangements and things, and to help us get a sense of what American Baptists are up to in the world. So let us close with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for your Spirit which is clearly at work, not only in the lives of Christians, but in the world, throughout the world, oh God, mending brokenness. And we give you thanks for the ministry of Roy and Pat Medley and so many others who seek to build bridges. And we pray that we could be a part of that work too. It is in your name we pray. Amen.